The glass shattered before anyone understood why. 1 second, Min Jun Cho was standing at the head of the boardroom table, calm as stone, the way he always was. The next, his fist had come down so hard the crystal water pitcher exploded across the mahogany, and 12 grown men in $1,000 suits flinched like children. Shards skittered across the polished wood. Water pooled black under the overhead lights. Nobody breathed. "Get out," he said. His voice never rose. It never needed to. They left. Fast. Chairs scraped. A phone clattered to the floor and nobody stopped to pick it up. Nobody argued with Min Jun Cho when his eyes went flat like that, flat the way a lake goes flat right before a storm hits it, all that violence just underneath a surface that refuses to show it. Only one person didn't move. She was standing near the door with a tray in her hands, glass at her feet, water soaking into the hem of her uniform. She hadn't flinched either. He looked at her, really looked, for the first time in 3 years, and said, "Why are you still here?" "Because someone has to clean this up," she said. "And it isn't going to be you." He almost laughed. He hadn't laughed in longer than he could remember, and the almost of it startled him more than her words did. That was the first time Amara Whitfield ever spoke back to him. It would not be the last. And by the end of this story, the coldest man in 3 cities would learn that the woman he paid to mop his floors was the only person alive who was never afraid of him, and that terrified him more than any rival ever had. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit like right now. It helps more people find this video, and trust me, you do not want to miss where this goes. Nobody in that boardroom knew what had actually caused the outburst. They assumed money. They assumed a bad deal, a leak, a betrayal among their own. They were wrong, and none of them would ever be told the truth, that 10 minutes before the meeting, Min Jun Cho had received a phone call informing him that a warehouse belonging to his organization had just gone up in flames with 3 of his men still inside it, and that the fire had not been an accident. He had walked into that boardroom anyway. He had sat through 11 minutes of a shipping proposal without a flicker on his face. And then, when a junior associate made an offhand joke about losses being part of the business, something in him simply broke. That was who Min Jun Cho was to the world. A man who absorbed catastrophe silently for as long as he could stand it, and then detonated without warning, and then went back to being silent again, as if the eruption had never happened. What really happened that night in the warehouse? Why did it take a maid with a mop to be the only person unafraid of him? And what truth was buried underneath 20 years of a man teaching himself not to feel anything at all? There were other questions too, ones nobody in his organization would have dared ask him directly. Why did the coldest man in 3 cities keep a photograph he never looked at, in a drawer he never opened in front of anyone? Why did he disappear into silence on the same date every year, refusing food, refusing company, refusing to explain himself to the handful of people close enough to notice the pattern? And what would it take, what could possibly take, to make a man like that feel something again, after 20 years of very deliberately teaching himself not to? The answer was already standing in his house, dusting his shelves, humming a gospel psalm under her breath, and neither of them had the faintest idea yet how much that answer was going to cost, or how much it was going to give back in return. Stay with this one. It rewards the people who see it through to the end. To understand Min Jun Cho, you had to go back to when he was 14 years old, hiding behind a dumpster in an alley behind a restaurant that, to this day, he refused to walk past. His father, Taeyang Cho, had not been a violent man by nature. He had been, in the language his son would later use to describe him, with something between contempt and grief, sentimental. He trusted the wrong people. He believed loyalty could be earned through kindness in a business built entirely on fear. He gave second chances to men who did not deserve first ones, and one of those men, a Lieutenant Taeyang, had personally pulled out of debt twice, decided that mercy was a weakness worth exploiting. Min Jun had been waiting outside, the way he always did on nights his father took meetings in that part of the city, sitting on an overturned crate with a comic book he wasn't really reading. He heard the raised voices first. Then the sound that he would spend the rest of his life trying not to hear in his sleep, 3 shots, spaced apart, unhurried, like whoever was firing them had all the time in the world. He didn't run. He hid. He put his hand over his own mouth so hard his teeth cut into his palm, because some animal part of his 14-year-old brain understood that if he made a single sound, he would be next. He watched the men walk out of that restaurant laughing. He did not go to the police. There was no point. Everyone who might have listened was already paid to look away, or already too afraid to. Instead, he went home, washed the blood off his hands that wasn't his, and sat alone in the dark until morning, promising himself the only thing he had left to promise: he would never be soft again. Not for money. Not for power. Not for anyone's tears, least of all his own. The years between 14 and 22 were not years he spoke of to anyone, ever, not even to Ji-ho, who had been beside him for most of them. He had been taken in by an uncle who ran a smaller, meaner operation on the other side of the city, a man who saw in his brother's grieving son not a child to protect but a tool to sharpen. Min Jun was taught to fight before he was taught to shave. He was taught to read a room for weapons before he was taught to read a contract. He was taught, above all else, that the boy who cried behind the dumpster was dead, and that whoever woke up in his place had better be someone considerably harder to kill. He learned the lesson completely. By 18, he had already surpassed his uncle's expectations in ways that made the older man uneasy, watching his own protégé become something colder and more precise than he had ever intended to create. By 20, men who had once worked for his father were quietly transferring their loyalty to the son instead, drawn by the particular magnetism of someone who never made a promise he didn't keep and never made a threat he didn't follow through on. By 22, he had swallowed his father's organization whole, piece by piece, and rebuilt it in his own image, colder, sharper, ruthlessly efficient. By 30, men who had once considered his father a pushover spoke his name like a superstition, something you didn't say too loudly at night. By 36, he had exactly what he'd set out to build, buildings with his name on the deed but never on the door, men who called him sir and meant it out of fear rather than respect, in a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked down on the city like it belonged to him, because in every way that mattered, it did. And a rotating parade of women who wanted access to that view, and nothing underneath it. Actresses. Heiresses. A senator's daughter, once, who cried in his private elevator when he told her that whatever she thought this was, it wasn't that, and never would be. He didn't feel guilty watching her cry. He rarely felt anything at all anymore. He had trained himself out of feeling the way other men train for marathons, slowly, deliberately, one deliberate mile at a time, until the thing that used to hurt simply stopped registering as pain. His right-hand man, a quiet, watchful man named Ji-ho who had been with him since they were both 20, used to joke, carefully, because even jokes could land wrong with Min Jun, that his boss's heart had a keypad on it, and that he'd lost the code so long ago even he didn't remember what it used to open. One day, Ji-ho told him once, half joking, half not, over drinks neither of them was really drinking, somebody's going to walk in who doesn't care about the keypad at all. Somebody who just picks the lock without asking permission. That sounds like a security risk, Min Jun said. It sounds like the only thing that's ever going to save you, Ji-ho answered, and Min Jun changed the subject, because he didn't like being told things that sounded uncomfortably close to true. Amara Whitfield came into that household the ordinary way. An agency sent her over after a phone screening and a background check that took longer than she expected, given that the job was, on paper, just housekeeping. She needed the work badly enough that she didn't ask too many questions about the man she'd be working for, though the other staff whispered plenty in the break room, that he never smiled, that he'd fired the last housekeeper for rearranging his books, that you did not want to be in the building the day something in his world went wrong. She had buried her mother 8 months earlier. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed too late because her mother had spent years putting off doctor's visits she couldn't afford, working 2 jobs to keep a roof over both their heads. Amara had held her hand at the end, in a hospital room with fluorescent lights that never seemed to turn off, and made her mother a promise that she intended to keep no matter what it cost her, that her 16-year-old brother, Malik, would finish school, would go to college, would get to have the life their mother never got the chance to have. She had exactly $400 between herself and a shut-off notice on the lights when the agency called with the job. She took it without hesitating. She did not come to be seen. She came to work, and to survive, and to keep a promise to a woman in the ground. For the first year, Minjun did not know her name. He knew there was a housekeeper. He knew the house was clean, the books dusted without being disturbed, the water glass on his desk always refilled before he noticed it was empty. He did not connect any of that to a person. People who worked in his house were, to him, functions, reliable, replaceable, invisible by design. That was how he preferred it. Invisibility meant no one got close enough to be used against him. He had no idea that the woman who kept his house running had, several times, quietly covered for staff mistakes that would have gotten someone fired, had learned which of his moods meant leave the room now and which meant he actually wants someone in the room, he just won't say so, had, on the anniversary of a date he never named, Minjun disappeared into his study every year on that date and refused all food, started leaving a small, plain meal outside the door anyway, because something in her refused to let a person go hungry out of grief, even a person who terrified everyone else in the building. He never mentioned it. She never mentioned it. It became a small, silent ritual that neither of them acknowledged existed. She learned him the way you learn weather, not by asking, but by watching what happens right before the storm. She learned that he flinched, just barely, at the sound of glass breaking, though he was almost always the one who broke it. She learned that he read, actual books, poetry mostly, hidden in the bottom drawer of his desk under a stack of shipping manifests, but would rather die than admit it out loud. She learned that when he was at his most dangerous, his voice got quieter, not louder, and that the people who survived him longest were the ones who understood that his silence was the warning, not the absence of one. She never mentioned any of it. That was the thing that eventually got under his skin. Every other person in his life was performing for him, angling for something, a favor, a promotion, a place closer to the throne. She wasn't angling for anything. She dusted his bookshelves and refilled his water and left the room, and somehow that made him more curious about her than any woman who had ever tried to seduce him in an elevator. "You've worked here 2 years, he said to her once, out of nowhere, while she was setting down his tea. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out before he decided to let it. "Amara," she said, not looking up from arranging the cup just so. "You could have asked any time. I'm asking now. 2 years late." She wasn't smiling when she said it, but there was something underneath the words, dry and unbothered, and it hit him strangely, like a door he hadn't noticed was locked had just clicked open a centimeter, letting in a draft from somewhere he couldn't identify. He didn't say anything else that night. But 3 days later, he realized he'd learned her name and hadn't stopped hearing the way she said 2 years late, like she was daring him to be embarrassed about it, like his money and his silence and his reputation didn't intimidate her even a little. He was not a man who got embarrassed. He filed the feeling away like a threat he couldn't yet identify, the way he filed away every unfamiliar thing, and told himself he would forget about it by morning. He did not forget about it by morning. Amara had her own confidant in that house, a cook named Teresa who had worked for wealthier families than Minjun Cho and had seen enough to know exactly what kind of trouble a man like him could cause a woman like Amara. "You're spending too much time thinking about him," Teresa told her one evening, chopping vegetables with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times before. "I've watched you. You used to come in, do the job, Go home to that brother of yours. Now you linger. You find reasons to be in rooms he's in. I do not linger. Amara. Baby. You lingered for 11 minutes in the study yesterday dusting a shelf that didn't need dusting. Teresa didn't look up from the cutting board. I'm not judging you. I'm telling you to be careful. Men like him don't fall in love the way regular men do. When they do fall, they fall like buildings. And when buildings fall, baby, everybody standing near them gets hurt, not just the building. I'm not falling for anyone, Amara said, and even she didn't believe herself when she said it. Teresa said, which was worse than any argument she could have made out loud. Amara thought about that conversation more than she wanted to admit over the following weeks. She thought about her mother, who had spent her whole life being underestimated and overworked by people who never once asked her name before asking her to fix something. She thought about the promise she'd made in a hospital bed, and how none of that promise had ever included falling for the kind of man whose name made grown men flinch in boardrooms. And still, despite every warning bell in her own head, she found herself looking forward to the sound of his study door opening in the evenings, found herself paying attention to which nights he skipped dinner and which nights he didn't, the way you pay attention to someone you've already, quietly, without permission from your own better judgment, decided matters to you. Jiho noticed the shift before Minjun would ever admit to it out loud. You asked the housekeeper her name, he said one afternoon, not quite a question. Is that a problem? It's a first. Jiho set down the file he'd been reviewing. In 15 years I've watched you learn the names of judges you were planning to bribe faster than you learn the names of people who work in your own house. That's not a criticism. It's an observation. Note it and move on, Minjun said, and Jiho did, but he watched his boss more closely after that, the way a man watches whether he can't yet name but can feel coming. If you're already invested in these two, drop a comment right now and tell us who you think is going to break first, Amara, or the man who's never lost control of anything in his life. Let's see how many of you called it right by the end. The turning point came on a night that started like every other night, and ended nothing like any night before it. Minjun had made an enemy. That wasn't unusual, men in his position collected enemies the way other men collected watches. But this one, a rival named Daesung Park, had decided that fear alone wasn't enough anymore. Park had spent 2 years watching Minjun expand into territory that used to belong to his family's operation, and pride, more than profit, had finally curdled into something uglier. He wanted humiliation. He wanted Minjun brought to his knees in front of the people who mattered, publicly, permanently. So he sent a message the only way men like that know how to send messages. He had one of Minjun's warehouses burned to the ground, with 3 of his men still inside. Minjun did not raise his voice when he got the call. That was the frightening part. He simply hung up the phone, walked to the bar cart in his study, and stood there for 11 minutes without moving, without pouring a drink, without doing anything except staring at the skyline like it owed him an explanation it refused to give. Jiho found him first and made the mistake of speaking before Minjun was ready to be spoken to. We know it was Park's people. We have 3 names. Say the word in. Not tonight. Minjun's voice was quiet in a way that made grown men nervous. Tonight I need to think, and I can't think with you standing here waiting for permission to start a war. Jiho left. He was used to reading the room, and the room, that night, was telling him to disappear. Amara found Minjun like that near midnight, on her way out after a double shift, coat already on, keys already in hand. She should have kept walking. Every instinct honed by 3 years of working in that house told her to keep walking, to let him have his silence, to not be the one person foolish enough to interrupt Minjun Cho on the worst night of his year. She didn't. You should sit down, she said quietly, setting her bag down by the door. You've been standing there long enough to grow roots. 3 men are dead because of me. It wasn't grief in his voice. It was something colder, the sound of a man doing arithmetic on a debt he intended to collect in full, tonight, with interest. Tonight, more men are going to die because of what I do next. Then maybe don't do it tonight, she said, moving closer, though every part of her rational mind was screaming that this was not her place, not her business, not a fire she should be walking toward. Grief makes terrible decisions look like justice. Sleep first. Decide in the morning what kind of man you want to be when the sun's up, not what kind of man tonight is telling you to become. He turned and looked at her the way he'd looked at her the day the picture shattered, like he was seeing something he'd walked past 100 times without ever actually looking at it. You have no idea what I am, he said. I know exactly what you are, she answered, not backing away, though her heart was hammering hard enough that she was certain he could hear it. I've been cleaning up after it for 2 years. I also know you haven't eaten today, and you keep a photograph of your father in a drawer you think nobody knows about, and you flinch every time a glass breaks even though you're usually the one who breaks it. Whatever you are, Mr. Cho, you're not a mystery to me. You're just a man who's very good at being alone, and who thinks that being alone is the same thing as being strong. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Min-jun Cho had nothing to say. Nothing sharp enough to push her out of the room, nothing cold enough to make her flinch and leave. He simply stood there, exposed in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be exposed since he was 14 years old and hiding behind a dumpster. And that's when he realized, the emptiness he'd built his whole life to protect had just been walked into, calmly, by a woman with a mop and a mouth that didn't know how to lie to him. He retaliated, of course, in the days that followed, quietly, efficiently, the way he always did, though he gave Ji-ho and the others strict instructions to keep the response contained, precise, nothing that would spiral into the kind of open war that got more innocent men killed. But something in him had shifted, some gear that had been locked in place since he was 14, and it would not lock back into position no matter how hard he tried to force it. He started finding reasons to be in rooms Amara was cleaning. He started asking her opinion on things he'd never asked anyone's opinion on before, not because he needed the answer, but because he wanted to hear how she'd say it, wanted to watch the particular way her jaw set when she disagreed with him and wasn't afraid to show it. He noticed the way she hummed under her breath when she thought no one could hear, an old gospel song her mother used to sing while cooking on Sunday mornings. He noticed that she never once, in 3 years, asked him for anything for herself, though he knew, because he made it his business to know everything about everyone in his orbit, that her brother's school fees were overdue and her car had a check engine light that had been on for months and she was one bad week away from real trouble. There was a night, before the envelope, before any of it, when Min-jun almost lost his nerve entirely and almost pretended none of it was happening. A woman named Vivian, an art dealer he'd been introduced to at a fundraiser months earlier, had begun calling again, beautiful, sharp, exactly the kind of woman his world expected him to end up with eventually, someone who understood the rules of his life without needing them explained. He agreed to dinner with her, mostly, if he was honest with himself, to prove to himself that whatever he was feeling toward a woman who cleaned his house was a passing malfunction, something he could override with the right distraction. The dinner was pleasant. Vivian was clever and funny and asked nothing of him he wasn't already used to giving. He came home afterward and found Amara in the kitchen, finishing the last of the evening cleanup, and something in his chest sank the moment he saw her, a feeling he didn't have a name for yet because he had spent 20 years refusing to need one. "Good dinner?" she asked, not looking up, her voice carefully neutral in a way that told him she already knew, somehow, where he'd been and with whom. "It was fine." "Good." She kept wiping down the counter. "I'm glad." "Amara. You don't owe me an explanation, Mr. Cho." The formality landed like a slap, deliberate, a wall going back up exactly where a door had briefly opened. "I work here. That's all I am to you. I should have remembered that sooner." He stood in that kitchen for a long moment, furious at himself in a way he rarely allowed himself to be furious at anyone, let alone the person staring back at him in the reflection of a dark window. He had spent an entire evening trying to prove to himself that Amara didn't matter, and the only thing the evening had proven was the opposite, conclusively, in a way he could no longer argue himself out of. He did not call Vivian again. He did not explain that to Amara either, not directly, some part of him still too proud, too unpracticed at saying things plainly. But 3 days later, he had the envelope placed on the counter, telling himself it was a bonus, telling himself it meant nothing beyond gratitude for years of good work, when both of them already knew, underneath all of that careful language, exactly what it actually meant. He had a habit of solving problems with money. It was the only language he trusted, the only currency he'd ever really believed in. So one afternoon, he had an envelope placed on the kitchen counter, enough to cover the school fees, the car, and considerably more, with no note, because men like him didn't write notes, didn't explain themselves, didn't need to. She found it before her shift ended. She stared at it for a long moment, feeling something complicated rise in her chest, not gratitude, not quite anger, something closer to insult. Then she walked straight into his study without knocking, which no one did, ever, and set the envelope down in front of him like it was something that had gone bad in the refrigerator. "I don't want this," she said. He didn't even look up from his desk right away. "It's not charity. Consider it a bonus. I've worked here 3 years. You've never once given a bonus. Don't start now, when it's obviously about something else." She held his gaze, and it unsettled him how little effort it seemed to cost her, how she didn't so much as blink under the weight of a stare that made grown men look at their shoes. "You don't know how to say what you actually mean, so you throw money at it instead. That might work on everyone else in your life, Mr. Cho. It's not going to work on me." He stood up so fast the chair nearly tipped backward. For a moment, the old coldness flared, the instinct to remind her exactly who paid her salary, exactly whose house this was, exactly how easily replaceable everyone in his employ was supposed to be. He opened his mouth to say something sharp enough to put her back in her place, the way he'd put 100 people in their place before her. What came out instead was, "Then tell me what will." The room went silent. Even the city outside the window seemed to hold still, waiting. "The truth," she said finally, quieter now, some of the fight draining out of her voice, replaced by something gentler. "You could try that. Just once. See how it feels. If your heart is racing right now, this is exactly the moment to comment still watching, because what happens next changes everything you think you know about both of them." The truth, when it finally came slowly, like ice breaking on a lake, small cracks first, then all at once. He told her about his father. About the alley behind the restaurant he still refused to walk past. About the 11 minutes he'd spent hiding behind a dumpster with his own hand over his own mouth, terrified that breathing too loudly would get him killed. He told her about the years he'd spent training himself not to feel anything, because feeling had gotten his father killed, and he had sworn he would never die the same soft, sentimental death. He told her things he had never told a therapist, a lawyer, a lover, or a priest, because he had never let a therapist, lawyer, lover, or priest close enough to hear them. He told them instead to a woman standing in his kitchen in a work uniform with flowers still on her sleeve from helping the cook that afternoon, because some part of him had decided, without asking permission from the rest of him, that she was the only person in his life he could trust not to use it against him later. She didn't flinch. She didn't pity him, which he would have hated and which would have made him retreat immediately behind every wall he'd ever built. And she didn't excuse him either, which he would have distrusted just as fast. She just listened, the way she'd been listening for 3 years without him ever noticing, and when he finally finished, she said the only thing that had ever actually reached him in 20 years. "You've spent 20 years punishing yourself for surviving something a 14-year-old boy had no power to stop. That's not strength, Min-jun. That's just a different kind of grief, wearing a very expensive suit." It was the first time she had ever used his first name. Something in his chest, something he would have sworn, under oath, no longer existed, cracked wide open. He didn't say anything for a long time. Neither did she. Why do you disappear every year on that date? She asked eventually, gently, the question she'd been carrying unspoken for 3 years finally finding room to exist between them. I've never asked. I didn't think it was mine to ask. But I think I'd like to know now, if you're willing to tell me. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. Then, finally, it's the day he died. I don't fast because I think it honors him. I fast because it's the only day of the year I let myself actually feel what happened instead of burying it under work. The rest of the year, I don't let myself remember the sound the shots made, or the way he looked walking into that restaurant that afternoon, completely unaware it would be the last ordinary afternoon of his life. One day a year, I let it in. The other 364, I make sure nothing gets close enough to remind me. And now? Now there's you, he said, leaving meals outside my door on that day every year, never saying a word about it, never asking me to explain myself. You've been quietly refusing to let me disappear into it completely for longer than I even realized you were doing it. He looked at her, something raw and unguarded in his face that she had never seen there before. I don't know how to thank someone for that. I'm not sure the language exists. You don't have to thank me, she said. You just have to stop disappearing. That's all I've ever wanted from you, Min-jun. Not gratitude. Just for you to actually be here, the rest of the days, the way you're here right now. She simply reached out and rested her hand over his, the way you'd steady someone standing too close to an edge, and for once in his life, Min-jun Cho did not pull away from the touch. He let it happen. He let himself, for one single night, stop being the man who survived the alley, and simply be a man, tired and unguarded, sitting in his own kitchen at midnight with someone who had finally seen all of him and hadn't run. What passed between them after that belongs to them, and not to this story. Some things are not for telling. But by morning, the coldest man in 3 cities woke up beside someone for the first time in his adult life without immediately calculating what it would cost him, and for the first time in 20 years, that terrified him less than the alternative of losing it. It did not stay simple for long. Nothing that mattered to Min-jun Cho ever did. Amara pulled back first, 3 days later, and it caught him off guard in a way almost nothing caught him off guard anymore. I need this to stop, she told him, arms crossed, standing several careful feet away from him in a hallway where anyone might walk past. Not because I don't, she stopped herself, chose different words. Not because of how I feel. Because of what I am to this house. I clean your floors, Min-jun. I'm on payroll. If anyone finds out about this, they won't see a man and a woman who care about each other. They'll see a rich man and the maid he's sleeping with, and that story will follow me for the rest of my life, long after you've moved on to whatever comes next. I have a brother depending on me. I can't afford to become a rumor. It stung more than he expected, mostly because she wasn't wrong, and mostly because some old, ugly instinct in him, the same instinct that had once made him tell a senator's daughter that whatever she thought this was, it wasn't, wanted to prove her right by walking away first, before she could. He didn't. Then quit, he said instead. Not the job. The uniform. Work for me in a role that has your name on it, not your title. Head of household operations, whatever they call it on paper, I don't care what it says on paper. I care that nobody in this city gets to look at you and see anything other than exactly who you are. You can't fix this with a job title. I'm not trying to fix it, he said. I'm trying to stop being a coward about it. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he wondered if he'd said too much, moved too fast, asked for something she wasn't ready to give. Then, finally, something in her face softened. Ask me properly, she said. Not because you're afraid of losing me. Because you actually want this. I want this, he said, and for the first time since he was 14 years old, his voice shook slightly when he said something that mattered. I've never wanted anything the way I want this. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was messier than that, and slower, and it came with real conditions and real fear on both sides. But it was honest, and honesty was a currency Min Jun Cho had never traded in before her. Word travels fast in circles like his. Within 2 weeks, Dae-sung Park knew exactly where to aim if he wanted to hurt Min Jun Cho in a way bullets never could. He didn't touch Min Jun directly. He was smarter than that, and crueler. He went after Amara instead, had her followed for days without her noticing, had her 16-year-old brother Malik's school visited by 2 men who smiled too much and asked too many questions about his sister's employer, sent Min Jun a single photograph with no message attached, because none was needed. The photograph showed Amara walking Malik to the bus stop that morning. The message was the photograph itself. I know what you love now. And I know exactly how to take it apart, piece by piece, starting with the boy. Min Jun had been ruthless before, many times, over many years. This was different. This was a man who had spent 20 years building walls precisely so that nothing could ever be used against him again, discovering, in the space of one photograph, that he had let someone in anyway, and that the world had noticed before he'd even let himself admit it to his own reflection in the mirror. He went to Amara that same night, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw real fear on his face, not for himself. You need to leave, he told her, pacing, unable to sit still, unable to look at her directly. Take Malik. I'll set the 2 of you up somewhere far from here, another city, another name if it comes to that, somewhere Park will never think to look, and I'll wire enough money that neither of you ever has to worry about anything again, and... No, she said. Amara, you don't understand what he's capable of. I've seen it. I've seen what he did to that warehouse. He will not hesitate to hurt your brother to get to me, and I will not let that happen, so you need to go, tonight, and... No, she said again, louder this time, cutting through his spiral. She crossed the room and took his hands, hands that had signed off on things that ended other men's lives without a tremor, and were shaking now, for her and for a 16-year-old boy who had nothing to do with any of it. I understand exactly what he's capable of. I understand what you're capable of too, better than almost anyone alive. What I don't understand is why you think the answer to fear is to send away the one person who isn't afraid of you. Her voice cracked slightly, but she held his eyes anyway. I didn't survive burying my mother alone, raising my brother alone, for years of scraping by on nothing, just to run now because a man with too much money and not enough sense decided to threaten a child to scare a grown man. We face this. Together. Or you can go right back to being alone in that penthouse, deciding you were right all along to build every single one of those walls. He looked at her for a long moment, jaw tight, every protective instinct in him screaming to override her, to force her onto a plane tonight whether she agreed or not. But underneath the fear was something else, something that had been growing quietly for months, respect. She had never once been someone he needed to protect from her own choices. She had only ever been someone strong enough to make the right ones on her own. Together, he said finally. The days that followed were the most dangerous of both their lives, though they unfolded very differently than either of them expected. Min Jun did not retaliate the way Park anticipated, did not send men into the night, did not burn anything down in return, did not answer violence with more of the same. He did something Park never saw coming, because it was not the language Park's world spoke in. Min Jun exposed him. Every falsified shipment. Every bribed official. Every buried body Dae-sung Park believed was buried deep enough to never see daylight again. Piece by piece, carefully assembled, handed not to hired men in dark alleys but to exactly the people who could not be bribed to look away, federal investigators who had been building a case against Park for years and had never had enough to make it stick, until now. It began with Ji-ho spending 3 sleepless nights in a rented office downtown, cross-referencing a decade of shipping manifests against customs records that didn't match, building a paper trail that Park's lawyers would eventually spend months failing to unravel. Min-jun sat with him some of those nights, sleeves rolled up, doing work he hadn't done with his own hands in years, because he refused to let this be something he simply ordered done from a distance. This one, he told Ji-ho, he needed to be part of directly. You could still just have him killed, Ji-ho pointed out, not entirely joking, somewhere around 3 in the morning on the second night. Would be faster. Faster isn't the same as better. Min-jun didn't look up from the documents in front of him. My father made deals with men like Park his whole life and it got him killed in an alley in front of his own son. I'm done playing that game by those rules. If I bury Park the old way, I become exactly the thing I swore at 14 I'd never become. If I bury him with the truth, I become something else. Something Amara could actually respect waking up next to. Ji-ho didn't argue with that. He simply kept working. The investigators moved carefully once the files reached them, building corroboration slowly enough that Park never suspected the walls closing in until it was far too late to run. There was a tense week when word reached Min-jun that Park had somehow learned an informant was cooperating with federal authorities, and had decided, in a fit of desperate rage, to accelerate his plans against Amara's family before his own collapse could catch up with him. That was the week Ji-ho's people intercepted the car outside Malik's school and the man following Amara too closely near the store, not isolated scares, as it turned out, but the opening moves of something Park intended to escalate dramatically if he wasn't stopped in time. Min-jun made the decision, against Ji-ho's advice, to move Amara and Malik into the penthouse itself for the final 2 weeks of the investigation, under protection around the clock, rather than risk them anywhere Park's increasingly desperate people might reach. Amara resisted at first. She didn't want to feel like a prisoner in someone else's gilded cage, however well-intentioned, but relented when she saw Malik's face the night they moved in, the exhausted relief of a 16-year-old who had been quietly terrified for weeks without ever once saying so out loud to his sister, not wanting to add to her burden. It took time. It required patience Min-jun didn't naturally have, and Amara's steadiness became the thing that held him together through weeks of watching Park's people circle closer, testing, probing, looking for a weak point to exploit before their window closed. There was one night, close to the end, when Park's men grew desperate enough to try something reckless, a car that idled too long outside Malik's school, a man who followed Amara 2 blocks too closely on her way to the store. Ji-ho's people intercepted both before either amounted to more than a warning shot. Min-jun did not sleep that night, sitting up with Amara until dawn, neither of them speaking much, just present. Just there, learning that fear shared between 2 people weighs less than fear carried alone. There was a harder night than that one, though, closer to the middle of the ordeal, when Malik himself found out more than either of them wanted him to know. He came home from school early, having heard whispers from a classmate whose father worked in finance and had heard things about the man his sister worked for, and confronted Amara in the kitchen, 16 years old and furious in the specific, frightened way teenagers get furious when they suspect the adults around them are lying to protect them. Is it true? He demanded. The things they're saying about him? That he's dangerous? That people who cross him disappear? Amara set down what she was holding very carefully, buying herself a second to choose her words. Some of it, she said, because she had promised her mother she would never lie to him, not even to protect him. Some of it isn't true. Some of it is more complicated than the version you heard at school. And you're, what, together with him now? With a man like that? I'm with a man who spent most of his life surviving things nobody should have to survive, and who is trying, every single day, to be someone better than what that survival turned him into. She reached for her brother's hand, the way she had 1,000 times since their mother died, the gesture that had held both of them together through worse nights than this one. I need you to trust me, Malik. Not blindly. Just enough to let me prove it to you over time, the way I've had to prove everything else to you since Mom passed. Malik didn't answer right away. But he didn't pull his hand back either, and that, for the moment, was enough. Min-jun heard most of that conversation from the hallway, where he'd stopped, uninvited, on his way to find Amara about something else entirely. He didn't interrupt. He simply stood there and listened to a 16-year-old boy ask the exact question that had haunted Min-jun his entire adult life. Is it true that people like you leave nothing but damage behind them? And listen to Amara answer it with more grace than he'd ever managed to answer it for himself. Later that night he sought Malik out directly, alone, without Amara present, which took more courage than facing down men twice the boy's size ever had. I won't insult you by pretending the stories are all lies, Min-jun told him, standing in the doorway of the room Malik was staying in that week. Some of what you heard is true. I've done things I'm not proud of, and some of them I'd do again if it meant protecting people I care about. But I want you to know that your sister is not a chip on a table for me. She's the only reason I'm trying to become someone who deserves to be trusted by a kid smart enough to ask hard questions instead of swallowing easy answers. Malik studied him for a long moment, the same unflinching evaluation Amara gave everyone, clearly inherited rather than coincidental. If you hurt her, Malik said finally, I don't care how dangerous you are. If I hurt her, Min-jun said, I'll deserve whatever you decide to do about it. Malik studied him a moment longer, then asked the question that had clearly been sitting underneath everything else he'd said that night. Were you scared? What had happened to you? When you were my age, or close to it, and you lost your dad the way people are saying you did. Min-jun considered lying, the way he'd lied to everyone for 20 years about exactly how much that night had cost him. He decided, for reasons he didn't fully examine in the moment, that Malik deserved better than the version of the truth he gave everyone else. I was more scared than I've ever been before or since, he said. I spent years afterward making sure nobody would ever see that fear again, including myself. It took your sister showing up in my life to make me admit it happened at all. He paused. I'm not telling you that so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I think you're old enough to know that the men who seem the most unshakable are usually just the ones who are best at hiding how badly they were shaken once. Don't mistake that hiding for strength. It isn't. Real strength is what your sister's been doing for you the last 8 months, showing up every day even when she's exhausted, without ever once pretending it doesn't cost her something. Malik didn't say anything else that night, but something shifted in the way he looked at Min-jun afterward. Not trust exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something that could eventually become it. It wasn't friendship, not yet. But it was respect, earned honestly, the only currency Min-jun had ever really trusted, and this time, for once, it wasn't his own money buying it. I used to think love was the thing that got my father killed, he told her quietly, somewhere around 4 in the morning, watching the sky start to lighten at the edges. I've spent 20 years believing that. I think I had it backward the whole time. What do you think now? She asked. I think it wasn't love that killed him. It was trusting the wrong people, and never getting the chance to be wrong about the right one. He turned to look at her, exhausted and unguarded in a way that would have been unthinkable to the man he'd been a year earlier. I don't want to run out of time the way he did. Not without knowing what it feels like to be right about someone, even once. Dae-sung Park did not survive the fallout of his own empire the way he expected to. Min-jun did not have to lift a single hand against him directly. The truth, aimed carefully and patiently, turned out to be sharper than any blade he'd ever used in 20 years of building his name into something people whispered instead of spoke. Malik never fully knew how close danger had actually come. That had been the point from the very beginning. Some battles are fought precisely so the people you love never have to carry the weight of knowing they happened at all. The morning after it was finally, truly over, Min-jun found Amara on the terrace of the penthouse, watching the sun come up over a city that, for the first time in 20 years, did not feel like something he had to conquer just to survive in. You could have run, he said, sitting down beside her. Any sane person would have taken the money and disappeared the second I offered it. I stopped being interested in surviving alone a long time ago, she said, not looking away from the skyline. Running alone isn't really living. It's just a slower kind of waiting. He sat down beside her, not across from her, the way he sat across from every other person in his life, negotiating, calculating, keeping careful distance. Beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. My father used to say something, he said quietly, before he died. I didn't understand it until now. He said the men who survive the longest aren't the ones who let nothing in. They're the ones brave enough to let the right thing in, and strong enough to protect it once it's there. I spent 20 years thinking he was wrong. That letting anything in was exactly what got him killed. And now I think he was the bravest man I ever knew, and I spent 2 decades punishing myself for a lesson I refused to actually learn. He turned to look at her, and for once, his eyes were not flat, not calculating, not guarded the way they'd been guarded since he was 14 years old hiding behind a dumpster. It took you 3 years of mopping my floors to show me I had it backward the entire time. He didn't die because he trusted too easily in general. He trusted the wrong man, once, at the wrong time. He never got the chance to be right about someone the way I've gotten to be right about you. Amara reached over and took his hand, and this time, neither of them let go. And that's when he finally understood, not every loss is the end of the story. Some losses are simply the price of admission for the chapter that comes after. The one where a man taught his whole life that softness gets you killed finally learns that it's the only thing that ever made him worth saving in the first place. Park's arrest, when it finally came, happened quietly, almost anticlimactically, exactly the way Min Jun had wanted it to. No gunfire, no headline-grabbing raid, just federal agents at an office door on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and a man who had spent his whole life believing fear was the only currency that mattered discovering, too late, that patience and paperwork could dismantle an empire just as thoroughly as any bullet ever could. He would spend the rest of his life in a courtroom and then a cell, and Min Jun never once had to look him in the eye to accomplish it. Jiho brought him the news personally, finding him on the terrace with Amara, watching the same skyline they'd watched together dozens of times by then. It's done, Jiho said simply. He's in custody. It's over. Min Jun didn't celebrate. He didn't pour a drink or make a call to gloat, the way the man he used to be might have. He simply reached over and took Amara's hand, and the two of them sat there together for a long time, saying nothing, letting the relief settle slowly instead of all at once, the way real relief does when the danger has been real enough to leave marks. What now? Amara asked eventually. Now, Min Jun said, I'd like to find out what an ordinary life feels like. I've never actually had one. I'm told they're supposed to be boring. I think I'd like that very much, as long as you're in it. Ordinary might be harder for you than you think, she said, a small smile finally breaking through. You've spent 20 years being a legend. Legends don't usually know how to make toast. I know how to make toast. You've never made toast in your life, Min Jun Cho. I've worked in this kitchen for 3 years. I would know. He laughed, actually laughed, the sound unfamiliar even to his own ears, rusty from disuse but real all the same, and for a moment neither of them said anything else, content simply to sit together in the quiet, ordinary, unremarkable relief of a danger finally past and a future, however uncertain, finally beginning to feel possible. Months later, the household had changed in ways the old staff still talked about quietly when they thought no one important was listening. There was no more envelope of guilt money left on counters. There was a name on a door that had never had one before, and a woman who ran not just a house but, eventually, an entire foundation Min-jun funded in his father's name, one that helped families exactly like the one Amara had grown up in, families one bad diagnosis away from losing everything, families who needed help before it became a tragedy instead of after. Teresa stayed on as head cook, and never once let Amara forget the night she'd warned her about buildings falling. I was right, though, she liked to say, with the particular satisfaction of someone who loves being right and loves the people she was right about even more. You fell. Both of you did. Good thing you fell toward each other instead of apart. Ji-ho, for his part, finally got the satisfaction of being right about something he'd said years earlier, though he was gracious enough not to say "I told you so" more than a handful of times a year, which for him counted as remarkable restraint. He watched Min-jun in board meetings now, still sharp, still exacting, still a man nobody in his right mind wanted as an enemy, but different, too. He asked after people's families before discussing quarterly numbers. He gave second chances, cautiously, carefully, nothing like his father's reckless sentimentality, but something more measured, something that had learned from both his father's mistake and his own 2 decades of overcorrection. On the anniversary of his father's death that year, for the first time in over 20 years, Min-jun did not disappear into his study alone. He and Amara went together to the cemetery instead, and he stood at his father's grave for a long time, saying nothing out loud, though Amara suspected, watching his face, that he was finally saying everything he'd never let himself say before. "I think you'd have liked her," he told the headstone quietly, before they left. "I think you'd have told me I was a fool for waiting so long." Amara didn't ask what he meant. She simply took his hand, the way she had 100 times by then, and walked with him back toward whatever ordinary, unremarkable, thoroughly undramatic life the two of them were building together, one patient day at a time, the kind of life a 14-year-old boy behind a dumpster could never have imagined surviving long enough to have, and the kind of life his father, in the end, would have wanted for him more than any empire. Years later, when people who didn't know the full story asked Amara how it happened, how a housekeeper ended up building a life alongside one of the most feared men in the city, she never told them the version with the boardroom, the shattered pitcher, the warehouse fire, or the federal investigation that finally brought Daesung Park down. She told them the smaller truth instead, the one that actually mattered. He was just a man who'd forgotten how to let anyone see him, she'd say. And I happened to be standing close enough, for long enough, to watch him remember. That, in the end, was the whole story. Not a mystery to be solved, not a mafia empire to be inherited or destroyed, not even really a romance in the way people usually mean the word. Just 2 people, each carrying grief the other one recognized on sight, choosing, slowly, carefully, against every instinct either of them had spent years perfecting, to stop carrying it alone, one ordinary morning after another, for the rest of the years they were lucky enough to get together, on purpose, every single time. Malik got his college acceptance letter in the spring. Min-jun read it twice before Amara did, standing in the kitchen where an envelope of money had once nearly ended everything between them, and for once in his life, he cried without trying to stop himself, without feeling ashamed of it, without reaching for the old training that told him softness was a weakness he couldn't afford. Ji-ho, watching from the doorway, only said, "Told you somebody would pick the lock eventually." Min-jun didn't argue with him. He didn't have it in him to argue with the truth anymore. If this story moved you even a little, if you found yourself rooting for 2 people who had every reason to stay guarded and chose each other instead, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell, because we tell stories exactly like this one every single week. Drop a comment and tell us, which moment hit you hardest? And if you believe people can find each other in the most unexpected places, no matter where either of them started out, give this video a like before you go. It genuinely helps this story reach the people who need to hear it most. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying with these 2 all the way to the end. That kind of loyalty from an audience is rare, and we notice it every single time. We'll see you in the next one.